I thought it was just another quiet evening, until 3 women from my neighborhood stepped in front of me and smiled. I had been walking down the familiar streets of my neighborhood, the kind of route I could navigate with my eyes half closed. The late afternoon sun slanted gently through the trees, scattering golden patches on the cracked pavement. The air was tinged with the faint sweetness of jasmine from a neighbor's garden, and for a moment, I let myself relax into the calm rhythm of the world. Then they appeared. 3 women, unknown, yet somehow familiar, blocked my way. They stood casually, leaning against a low brick wall and a lamppost, their presence commanding without needing to demand attention. I froze for a heartbeat, a subtle tension curling through me, an instinctive hesitation I didn't understand at first. They smiled. And it wasn't just a friendly, passing smile, it was deliberate, knowing, warm, as though they had been waiting for this very moment. The kind of smile that made your pulse shift without warning, like sunlight suddenly falling on your face. One of them, a woman in her early 40s with hair catching the sunlight in auburn streaks, tilted her head slightly, her eyes crinkling at the corners in a gesture that felt both casual and intimate. Another crossed her arms, posture relaxed, yet every line of her body suggested quiet confidence. The third shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her subtle movements drawing my attention without effort. My first thought was to step around them, awkwardly, but before I could move, one brushed past me. By accident. Her hand slipped along my arm in the briefest contact, soft and warm. A shiver ran through me, not entirely unpleasant, and I realized I had been holding my breath. It was a fleeting touch, yet it left a quiet imprint, a strange mixture of curiosity and hesitation I couldn't shake. I opened my mouth to speak, maybe a simple "hello?" but the words caught in my throat. Instead, we stood there, a small bubble of unspoken energy, the street around us continuing on without notice. I noticed the subtle details, the faint scent of perfume, the way sunlight highlighted the gentle curve of her jaw, the soft rustle of their clothing as they shifted in place. Something about them felt different from anyone I'd met before. They weren't loud or overt, yet their presence carried a quiet gravity, a warmth that was as subtle as the afternoon light. I felt a strange mixture of apprehension and fascination, like stepping into a story I didn't yet know the ending of. Finally, one of them spoke, her voice low but steady, drawing me back from the swirl of thoughts. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" The simplicity of the words, paired with the easy confidence of her tone, sent a ripple of awareness through me. I nodded, my voice catching slightly when I answered, and in that small exchange, I realized something had shifted. The world around us hadn't changed, yet everything felt different. In that moment, I sensed the start of something unexpected, a slow spark that would grow in ways I couldn't yet predict. And all it took was a smile, 3 pairs of eyes, and a fleeting touch to make the ordinary street feel charged with quiet possibility. This expanded version hits emotional immersion, narrator's hesitation, intrigue, and subtle nervousness. Sensory richness, sight, touch, sound, scent. Subtle romantic tension, fleeting touch, lingering glances, quiet smiles. After that first encounter, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind, the soft brush of a hand, the warmth of their smiles, the quiet way they seemed to notice everything about me without saying a word. And now, a few days later, I ran into them again, just around the corner from the same familiar street. This time, the tension felt different, not as sharp, but heavier with a kind of curious anticipation, like standing at the edge of water you're not quite ready to dive into. They greeted me immediately, their voices light and teasing. One, with sharp eyes softened by a gentle smile, leaned slightly forward. "We're starting to see you everywhere," she said, and I couldn't tell if it was a tease or a compliment. The way she said it made my chest tighten, a warm, uncomfortable flutter of self-consciousness that I couldn't quite shake. The street felt alive around us, but all I noticed were them. The subtle sway of their hair in the afternoon breeze, the soft shuffle of feet on concrete, and the quiet cadence of their laughter. It was light, easy, yet somehow carried a depth I couldn't name. When I laughed at one of their jokes, it felt like the sound was shared between us, hanging in the space just long enough to make me aware of the distance between us, and the distance I wanted to close. They fell into casual conversation with me, asking about work, my routines, even something as mundane as what I like to drink in the mornings. But the questions weren't idle. They were curious, attentive, like small gestures of care wrapped in ordinary words. One handed me a stray notebook I dropped, her fingers brushing mine just long enough to leave a spark of warmth. I caught myself staring at her hand, lingering a second longer than necessary, and she smiled in a way that made me forget to look away. Every gesture was deliberate yet subtle. A light touch on the arm when joking, leaning slightly closer when speaking, a fleeting glance that lingered just beyond polite acknowledgement. I felt the pull, the invisible gravity drawing me toward them, and yet there was a caution in me, a hesitation born of uncertainty, of the age difference I couldn't ignore, of the silent social rules that whispered caution. Even as we parted that afternoon, walking in different directions, the memory of their warmth stayed with me. The faint scent of one's perfume, the brush of another's shoulder against mine as we exchanged goodbyes, the quiet, steady way the third watched me with a smile that suggested she saw more than I intended to show, all of it lingered like a soft echo, a gentle pressure on my chest that I couldn't quite name. By the time I reached my own doorstep, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. The encounters were no longer random. They were part of a rhythm, a slow unfolding of connection. And while I was aware of my own awkwardness, of the strange flutter in my chest whenever one of them looked at me just so, I also felt a quiet anticipation, a warmth that hinted at deeper things to come. Something unspoken had begun between us, a subtle, delicate thread of curiosity and care, pulling me closer with every shared smile, every lingering glance, every light touch. And even in my hesitation, I felt that I wanted more. Deepens emotional connection through dialogue, subtle humor, and shared routines. Keeps slow-burn tension, lingering touches, careful glances, nervous anticipation. Rich sensory details, touch, scent, sound, and light. Expands narrator's internal conflict, curiosity versus hesitation, age gap awareness. After several casual encounters, the connection between us began to feel less like coincidence and more like a quiet rhythm. It started with small gestures, shared coffee on a neighborhood bench, brief conversations while walking past each other, laughter spilling over a common joke. Yet beneath the casualness, there was a subtle depth, a sense that each moment carried more than the surface revealed. I remember one particular evening, the street bathed in the soft orange glow of sunset. One of the women, the one whose auburn hair caught the light just so, was carrying groceries, struggling slightly with the weight of a paper bag. Without thinking, I stepped forward to take a bag from her. Our fingers brushed again, lingering longer than necessary, and I felt that familiar warmth pulse through my chest. She gave me a soft, grateful smile, and for a moment, our eyes held, something unspoken passing between us. The women invited me to join them on a short walk, and I found myself stepping into a world I hadn't expected. As we moved through the quiet streets, conversation flowed effortlessly, touching on mundane things at first, books we liked, the best cafe in the area, but gradually shifting into more personal territory. One of them spoke quietly about a recent heartbreak, her voice tinged with sadness but held with a quiet dignity. I listened, noticing the subtle tremor in her hands as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I didn't know what to say at first, but the simple act of being present, of allowing silence to sit between us comfortably, seemed to matter more than words. The other woman shared a story about a time she felt misunderstood at work, the tension in her shoulders easing as she spoke. I noticed the way she would occasionally glance at me, as if measuring whether I understood her beyond the words. Their vulnerability didn't feel forced, it was gentle, natural, and it drew me in like a tide I didn't want to resist. Sensory details filled the moment, the faint aroma of coffee from a nearby cafe, the cool evening air brushing my cheeks, the soft rustle of leaves overhead. Every subtle touch mattered, a hand lightly resting on my arm as she laughed, the brush of a shoulder as we navigated a narrow sidewalk, a momentary clasp of our hands when passing something between us. Each contact carried warmth, familiarity, and the subtle thrill of closeness without crossing any unspoken boundaries. By the end of the walk, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. There was something profound in these shared moments, a quiet intimacy that didn't need labels or promises. I realized that the connection wasn't about romance in its simplest form. It was about understanding, presence, and trust. And yet, beneath it all, a delicate tension simmered, a sense that something more could exist if we allowed it to unfold naturally. As we said our goodbyes, I felt the weight of the evening linger, the warmth of their smiles, the echo of their laughter, the subtle press of a hand that felt like a promise rather than a touch. Walking home, I knew that these shared moments were slowly changing me, awakening feelings I hadn't expected, and opening a door to something quietly transformative. Builds emotional intimacy through shared vulnerability and quiet, meaningful moments. Sensory immersion, sunset glow, scents, subtle touches, and body language. Slow burn romantic tension, lingering touches and glances without overt romance. It was in the small, ordinary moments that the tension between us began to thrum with an almost electric subtlety. Nothing had changed overtly, our walks, our conversations, our shared laughter, but something deeper had started to shift, threading its way through every glance and every brush of skin. I noticed it the first time I caught myself deliberately lingering a step behind or beside one of them, craving the warmth of proximity while simultaneously fearing it. That evening, we found ourselves walking along a quiet street lined with elm trees, their leaves whispering in the soft evening breeze. One of the women, the one with calm, observant eyes, fell into step beside me. Our shoulders brushed accidentally, or so I told myself, but the contact sent a shiver up my arm, a warmth that settled in my chest and made my heartbeat more insistent. I caught her glancing at me out of the corner of her eye, a faint smile tugging at her lips. I quickly looked away, a blush creeping up my neck, but I could feel her attention still lingering. We stopped at a small café she recommended, and the three of them leaned casually against the counter while I ordered. Standing close, I became acutely aware of the subtle details, the soft curl of her hair brushing against her cheek, the way her fingers tapped lightly against the counter, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the aroma of coffee. Each detail tugged at me in a way I couldn't articulate, awakening an attraction that was as quiet as it was undeniable. When we settled at a small corner table, conversation flowed easily, yet beneath the humor and stories, there was a charged undercurrent. A joke would land, and laughter would ripple, but the laughter seemed to linger a second too long, each smile carrying a hint of something more. One of them brushed her hand lightly against mine as she reached for a cup, and I froze, feeling the warmth of her skin seep through me. I realized, suddenly, that I wanted to savor the moment, wanted to prolong even the smallest touch. The tension wasn't only physical, it was in the pauses, the fleeting glances, the shared silences. When one of them spoke, I found myself listening more closely, attuned not just to the words but to the subtle shifts in her tone, the soft catch of her breath, the way her gaze lingered a moment longer than polite conversation required. My own awareness heightened, and I became conscious of the space between us, the warmth radiating from their bodies, and the unspoken desire that hovered, delicate but persistent. Walking home afterward, the evening air felt charged. Every subtle brush of clothing, every lingering look, every unspoken word seemed to resonate in a quiet symphony of tension. I was painfully aware of the age difference, of the social caution, yet none of that could dampen the pull I felt. It wasn't impatience or lust, it was a yearning to be closer, to share in these quiet intimacies without rushing, without crossing boundaries, and yet fully aware that the connection had shifted into something undeniably potent. By the time I reached my doorstep, my chest still hummed with the warmth of their proximity. That day, that walk, that fleeting touch, they had opened a door I wasn't ready to close. And in the quiet tension that lingered, I understood that the slow burn had begun in earnest, promising something beautiful if I had the patience to see it unfold. Builds romantic tension subtly, lingering touches, glances, and pauses. Maintains sensory depth, sight, touch, scent, and sound. Deepens internal conflict, age gap awareness, hesitation versus attraction. Prepares the story for the emotional confession in Part 5. The next encounter felt different, as though the invisible thread between us had tightened just enough to make every step, every glance, more significant. It was evening, the sky a muted canvas of purples and golds, and we had settled on a quiet bench in the small park near the neighborhood square. The hum of the city felt distant, almost muted, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a late bird. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and fading flowers, and I became acutely aware of how close they sat, how natural it felt to share this space. One of the women, the one with soft, deliberate movements and a voice that always seemed to anchor me, spoke first. She shared a memory from years ago, something deeply personal, tinged with regret and longing. I listened, watching the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers toyed with the edge of her sleeve. When she paused, I realized I wanted to reach out, to offer comfort in the simplest way possible. Tentatively, I let my hand hover near hers, and when she brushed it lightly, my chest tightened. That small touch said more than words ever could: understanding, empathy, an unspoken willingness to be present. The second woman, who always seemed to carry a quiet strength, spoke next, revealing a vulnerability I hadn't expected. She described moments of loneliness, of feeling misunderstood despite her outward confidence. Her eyes met mine, steady yet searching, as if gauging whether I could meet her honesty without judgment. I felt a lump in my throat. It was strange, how could three people, so different in manner and presence, draw me into such a delicate intimacy? I tried to speak, but words faltered at first. Then I found myself sharing pieces of my own hesitations, fears, and the quiet ache of wanting connection while worrying about boundaries. My voice was low, uneven at times, yet there was relief in letting these thoughts escape. I glanced at them, noticing the subtle nods, the gentle smiles that encouraged me to continue, and the way their presence radiated warmth and acceptance. The air between us seemed to pulse with quiet intensity. A hand rested briefly on my shoulder, a subtle brush of hair back from my forehead, a lingering gaze that made my chest swell and ache simultaneously. Each gesture was deliberate but gentle, a wordless affirmation that vulnerability was met with care, not judgment. By the time the conversation waned, the world felt smaller, warmer, as if the distance we had maintained was no longer necessary. I realized that these women, in their quiet confidence and openness, had begun to inhabit the spaces inside me I hadn't even known were empty. And though hesitation still lingered, the social caution, the awareness of our differences, the tension between desire and propriety had softened into something tender, something deeply human. As we stood to leave, our hands brushed again, just a fleeting contact, but it lingered in my memory like a promise. That night, walking home under dim streetlights, I understood that slow-burn connections weren't about rushing, they were about the courage to let someone in, to meet vulnerability with warmth, and to let desire simmer in the spaces between words and touches. Explores emotional vulnerability and heartfelt confession. Sensory immersion, cool air, scents, subtle touch, and ambient sounds. Subtle, non-sexual physical affection, hand touches, hair brushing, shoulder contact. Strengthens emotional intimacy while maintaining slow-burn romantic tension. The evening had a kind of magic that made the ordinary extraordinary. We had wandered together to the edge of the neighborhood park, where the city's hum softened into a gentle background murmur. The sun was dipping low, spilling golden light across the pavement, and the air carried that sweet, fleeting scent of late summer, warm, soft, and somehow intoxicating. I could feel it pressing against my senses as much as the presence of the three women walking beside me. For the first time, there was no teasing, no casual small talk. We simply walked, their arms occasionally brushing against mine, their proximity a silent acknowledgement of the connection that had been building over weeks. Every step seemed measured, deliberate, as if the world had slowed just enough for us to feel the subtle rhythms of each other's presence. We paused at a small bench overlooking the park's fountain. Water sparkled in the fading light, its gentle trickle blending with the faint rustle of leaves. One of the women, the one with calm, thoughtful eyes, sat beside me. She didn't speak at first. Instead, she let her hand hover near mine. I hesitated, heart thudding before our fingers intertwined, tentative at first, then gradually settling into a natural, quiet grip. The warmth of her hand was grounding, steady, and it made every fear I had about the age gap, about propriety, dissolve into something tender and unspoken. The other two women settled nearby, close enough to feel part of the moment yet giving space, their presence comforting rather than overwhelming. One brushed her hair back, and the soft movement carried a grace I could barely put into words. The subtle way she leaned slightly toward me as we talked, laughing quietly, made my chest ache with longing and admiration. The third rested a hand lightly on my shoulder, a grounding weight that felt like reassurance, like the universe had conspired to let this moment exist exactly as it was. We talked about everything and nothing, memories from childhood, dreams we had tucked away, fears that we rarely shared aloud. But it wasn't just the words, it was the way we listened to each other, how silences were comfortable rather than awkward, how every glance and touch seemed to speak volumes. I felt an overwhelming clarity, a deep knowing that this was a connection that transcended superficial attraction. It was emotional intimacy, layered with subtle desire, built slowly and carefully, reaching its quiet crescendo here on a bench bathed in golden light. At one point, one of them leaned slightly against me, her cheek brushing my shoulder, and the simple contact made my heartbeat stutter. The warmth of her presence, the subtle scent of perfume mingling with evening air, the gentle rhythm of her breathing, all of it coalesced into a clarity I couldn't ignore. I belonged here, with them, in this moment. The hesitation, the social norms, the doubts, they all melted away. As the sun slipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft purples and pinks, I realized that slow-burn romance wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic confessions. It was about this: small touches, lingering glances, shared silences, and the profound understanding that we were exactly where we were meant to be. And in that quiet, golden hour, I understood fully that the connection we had nurtured, gently and patiently, had blossomed into something real, tender, and beautifully undeniable. Emotional peak, clarity of connection and mutual understanding. Sensory immersion, sunset light, water trickle, scents, touch, and body language. Slow-burn romantic tension resolved subtly through proximity, hand-holding, and lingering touches. Prepares Keynote 7, warm resolution and shared happiness. The following days carried a quiet warmth, a sense of ease that hadn't been there before. The tension, the hesitation, and the cautious excitement that had defined our interactions slowly gave way to something steady, comforting, and real. Each encounter was no longer charged with uncertainty. Instead, it was filled with shared smiles, gentle touches, and the quiet knowledge that we had discovered something precious together. One evening, we met again in the same familiar street, the fading light of dusk washing the neighborhood in soft amber tones. The three women were waiting for me with their usual smiles, but this time there was no playful teasing, only an unspoken agreement that our connection had shifted into something deeper. As I approached, one of them slipped her hand into mine naturally, another brushed a strand of hair from my forehead, and the third leaned slightly closer, her presence comforting and warm. In that moment, I felt entirely at home among them, the earlier uncertainties dissolving into quiet happiness. We decided to take a slow walk together, arms occasionally brushing, shoulders leaning in just enough to feel the closeness without breaking the gentle rhythm. The streetlights flickered on, casting long, soft shadows that intertwined as we moved. Every laugh, every glance, every fleeting touch carried the weight of intimacy we had cultivated over weeks of shared moments. There was a harmony to our presence, a delicate balance of warmth, respect, and subtle romantic energy that needed no words to define it. As we walked, conversation flowed easily, memories, dreams, small jokes, but it was punctuated by the quiet language of touch, a hand resting lightly on my shoulder, fingers grazing mine as we passed a narrow spot on the sidewalk, the gentle tilt of a head toward me when laughter erupted. Each gesture reinforced the sense of belonging, of connection that had grown steadily and naturally, without force or rush. We reached a small neighborhood park where we had shared previous quiet evenings. The fountain sparkled under the soft glow of the streetlights, and the gentle hum of the city felt distant, almost protective of our moment. We paused, leaning on the railing, letting the calm settle over us. One of the women rested her hand on mine again, and the warmth that radiated through that simple touch brought a contented smile to my face. I could feel it mirrored in theirs, the subtle yet undeniable affection shining in their eyes. Finally, we lingered for a few moments in silence, simply absorbing the connection we had nurtured. No confessions were necessary now. The emotional intimacy, the quiet desire, and the deep understanding between us had spoken for themselves. In the gentle press of our hands, the shared laughter, and the steady rhythm of our proximity, we had reached a place of harmony. As we parted that night, walking in different directions but still close enough to feel the lingering warmth, I realized that this slow burn journey had transformed ordinary evenings into moments of profound connection. The neighborhood, once just a backdrop to daily life, had become a canvas for a quiet, tender, and fully realized romance, one that respected boundaries, embraced vulnerability, and celebrated the subtle beauty of human closeness. And as I glanced back to see their smiles, illuminated by the soft streetlight glow, I knew that we had found something lasting, gentle, and truly ours. Full emotional resolution, intimacy, trust, and mutual affection established. Sensory immersion, streetlights, soft dusk, touch, and quiet sounds of the neighborhood. Non-sexual but meaningful physical affection, hand-holding, shoulder touches, leaning in. Concludes slow burn, age gap romance naturally and satisfyingly for the audience. If you like, I can now combine all 7 expanded keynotes into a full, flowing YouTube-ready script with narration cues, dialogue, and pacing suggestions for storytelling. This would be ready to use almost as is for video narration.